Good afternoon. Today, I'd like to talk to you about the peopling of the New World. The first inhabitants of the Americas were migrants and were the descendants of pioneering populations that began to radiate out of the mother continent of Africa sometime after 70,000 years ago. Following a route that passed through the lost subcontinent of Beringia, these Upper Paleolithic hunter-gatherers left their homelands on the shores of the western Pacific during a time of climatic and social instability. To get from the North Pacific Rim to South America, these settlers were forced to cross borders between inhospitable, barren, truly unknown and desolate lands. There was a lack of advanced knowledge of the details of landscape, of flora and fauna, sources of reliably potable water, and deposits of raw materials. The ancestral migrants overcame these shortcomings, learning and adapting with a masterful skill found only among determined people. Only their existing knowledge and skill could be brought with them from their ancestral homelands. Human history in the Americas is a history of migrants, a history of how and why various aspects of the cultural systems that they brought with them changed or persisted. The first settlers arrived as complete societies, not blank slates. They were communities in transit, communities with great funds of knowledge, looking for a new life in a new world. It is not easy to begin to overcome boundaries of unknown scale, but the ancestors of the original people of the Americas did exactly that. There exists a reciprocal relationship between the cultural legacies of a people and the conditions encountered in a diasporic context. It is the degree to which the new situations can be accommodated within pre-existing systems of knowledge, technology, and social organization that largely determines how much selective change or adaptation will be required of the migrating population. The colonization of the Americas by the ancestors of today's First Nations has been a central theme of research for centuries. In the last 20 years, archaeologists working on the issue of initial arrival in North and South America have shown the increasingly high probability of an initial entry from Asia along a coastal route of the North Pacific continental edge. Recent discoveries at the Cooper's Ferry site in Idaho clearly show human presence south of the North American ice sheets by at least 16,000 years ago, more than 1,000 years before the opening of an ice-free corridor. This and other recent discoveries further support the hypothesis that people initially migrated into North America along a Pacific coastal route. Early sites like Cooper's Ferry, Idaho, Monteverde, Chile, and Paisley Caves, Oregon, among other localities, hold evidence that humans were present in the Americas before the appearance of Clovis. Despite the fact that Clovis peoples were not the first inhabitants of the Americas, the Clovis tradition is a very interesting historical and anthropological phenomenon in terms of the brevity of its few centuries of history, and its geographical extension from the Sonoran deserts, with the extraordinary site known as El Fin del Mundo, excavated by Guadalupe Sanchez, to the forests of the Pacific Northwest and the Great Lakes between Canada and the United States. The Clovis culture is still fascinating, but now it is also recognized that the mammoth hunters seen in countless museum dioramas were not the first inhabitants of the Americas, but the descendants of the pioneer groups that had different life paths and route of entry to the Americas that only recent findings in North and South America have brought to our awareness. The earliest archaeological evidence for the arrival of people in the Americas has been discovered at the Cooper's Ferry site in western Idaho, dating to around 16,000 years ago, more than 1,000 years before an ice-free corridor opened between the two North American continental glacial masses. This may be interpreted to support the hypothesis of the Pacific migration route to the Americas along its coasts, since the antiquity of the find precludes an interior route of arrival for the earliest occupants of Cooper's Ferry. If the initial human migration of the Americas actually followed such a coastal route, then we might expect to find the first sites along the coast, and that these sites should produce evidence of the first coastal settlements having deep traditional ecological knowledge about maritime environments and their resources. Critics often point out that the Pacific coastal sites are not as early as Clovis and other previous inland sites. However, in recent excavations on Cedros Island, Baja California, several late Pleistocene sites have been discovered that date close to and overlap with the Clovis tradition period. Cedros Island, Baja California, is a unique and special place. Measuring 35 kilometers north-south and 16 kilometers east-west, it also reaches to almost 1,400 meters in elevation. It is a large, rocky, high island in the Pacific Rim sense of the term. Marine layer fog consistently blankets the island, shrouding its flanks in a thick, life-giving girdle of water, upon which the plants of the island rely almost entirely, for it very seldom rains. Its vegetation ranges from desert flora at sea level to small pockets of pine forest clinging to the crests of the central spine. Its surrounding seas are prodigiously rich, and sea life abounds. In the thinking of the Cochimi, the contact period indigenous inhabitants of the region, this island was the Western Mountain, a sacred place, and cradle of origin of one of their lineages that gave structure to their social life. In fact, it is a mountain, drowned by the rise in sea level, becoming an island during the final centuries of the Ice Age, when the glacial masses of the northern hemisphere were rapidly melting. Four sites on Cedros Island have revealed human occupation dated to the final centuries of the Ice Age. Cerro Pedregose, Pike 44, Richards Ridge, Pike 49, El Peregrino Site, and Colina Castor, 88 and 91 respectively. In 2019, a binational team led by Matthew Delorier of California State University Northridge, Lauren Davis of Oregon State University, and Antonio Porcayo Micheline of the National Institute of Anthropology and History of Mexico, conducted excavations at 3 of these sites. The results of these investigations have been surprising, with extremely relevant findings for our understanding of the entry and settlement of some of the first human communities on the coast of the Americas. In all coastal regions, through time, people have found essential resources necessary for the flourishing of human communities. Even along the most arid coastlines, it is water that is often a limiting factor, not food or other nutrients. As global ice masses began to melt at the end of the Würm glaciation, many archaeological sites associated with these first coastal occupations of the Americas were incontrovertibly submerged or destroyed by rising tides. To the great benefit of our investigations, however, late Pleistocene sites on Isla Cedros display a pattern of being located in the vicinity of ancient springs, now extinct, located at least several dozen meters above even current sea level. Archaeological excavations show that the people who occupied these sites fished, hunted, and collected marine food resources and took them inland to live next to these springs. Our research has focused on these ancient occupations because they are surviving evidence of early coastal occupations that have more often been submerged on the continental shelf. Rather than live closer to the source of marine foods, the early inhabitants of Isla Cedros appear to have prioritized potable water and decided, based on available labor power and technology, that it was easier to move the food to the water than the converse. Observations like this one becoming of increasing interest as we pursue lines of investigation that focus on the nature and process of migration and settlement, rather than simply prospecting for radiocarbon dates. Excavations at these early sites show a series of cultural material buried in stacks of fine sands and silts. which reflect the repeated human occupations around the springs within a dry coastal environment. It was the attraction of water that caused these early inhabitants to move large quantities of seafood, raw materials, and other resources to relatively stable campsites in immediate proximity to large freshwater springs. In regions of the eastern Pacific Rim where drinking water was not as scarce, it is possible that occupations may have been more fluid in terms of location, and quite possibly located closer to the now drowned paleo coastlines. This would have had the effect of making early coastal sites in these more well-watered regions more susceptible to inundation and destruction by eustatic sea level rise. The constraints of arid landscapes like those of Baja California and Isla Cedros may have resulted in a higher survival rate for terminal Pleistocene residential sites. At Cerro Pedregose, one of the most salient and surprising discoveries of the 2019 field season was the shockingly abundant evidence for the manufacture and use of single-piece shell hooks. Here you can see one of them, complete, manufactured out of abalone shell, here in the midden, along with quartz debitage, mussel shell fragments. But this is an in situ shot of how these were actually being recovered. Here's some higher resolution lab photography showing one variety. These are the ones made out of that mussel shell. Note how they're using the growth lines in the shell as part of the design component here. There has to be a structural reason for that, and my guess is this was the strongest way to manufacture these hooks. They also range in size. You saw some of those larger ones, and here's a relatively smaller one, much smaller as a matter of fact. But not only the hooks are we finding, but we're also finding the weights, the line weights that would have gone along with that. This one manufactured out of stone, again, in situ excavation recovery shot with the inset there showing a cleaned up version. Here's one of the best preserved examples that we have. This one made out of mussel shell, and you can see, in fact, the manufacturing process where they're filing down different portions of that shell to make the shank of this hook, in particular in this view. We also have a example here of the abalone shell, just a couple of examples of those hooks as well. There's also evidence for the exploitation of a wide range of marine and terrestrial resources at these sites. And the early sites on Isla Cedros show a varied lithic toolkit, the stone tools, that includes abundant bifacials, knives, projectile points, as well as a whole series of tools made out of shell. Here you can see some of the more knife-like varieties, the one on the left being more heavily resharpened than the other two. Here on the left you can see a projectile point that looks very similar to other kinds of early Holocene terminal Pleistocene projectile points from the Pacific coast of South America. There's a variety of point called the Paihan point, and this bears a striking resemblance to many of those. Here's an example of one of those concholithic, flaked shell tools that they made by flaking thick Tivella clam, which they were also eating. And there's also uncommon examples of some rather enigmatic groundstone artifacts. These are these stone rings. It's not the same as the donut stones that you see in some other regions, but we have some interesting ideas about what these might be. Of special interest is the unifacial lithic industry, which is the single most diagnostic artifact type for the terminal Pleistocene sites on Isla Cedros. The microscopic analysis of these unifacial scraping tools reveals wear and polish on their margins resulting from the processing of agave fibers to make ropes, nets, fishing line, etc. And this insight is due not only to our work in the field, but to some experimental archaeology conducted by myself and graduate student Aaron Elzinga at Cal State Northridge, who wrote his thesis on this project and spent a lot of time making copies of these unifaces, scraping lots of different materials, scraping lots of agave. These are some of the agave fibers produced by Aaron Elzinga in that project. And they're making ropes, nets, fishing line, etc. Here is some example of some archaeologically recovered agave cordage from Isla Cedros. This is from a later site. This isn't from the terminal Pleistocene site. But to give you an idea that these sorts of things are recoverable in the preservational context of Isla Cedros archaeological deposits. To date, Cerro Pedregose, Site 44, has a collection of faunal remains that is the most diverse compared to any other archaeological site on Cedros Island over the last 12,000 years. The site has given thousands of fish remains, identified in 25 different taxa, accompanied by a wide range of mollusks, crustaceans, marine mammals, sea turtles, birds, rabbits, and endemic pygmy deer that still inhabit the island. Outside of the mollusks, fish, and crustaceans, the most consistent faunal elements recovered are those of turtles and marine mammals. Shell hooks are among the first specialized technologies in evidence on Isla Cedros and were used during a period of dramatic changes in climate, ecology, and coastal geomorphology. The lowest layers in the Richards Ridge site are dated in excess of 12,700 years old, while Sitio Peregrino, Pike 88, has produced the oldest date thus far obtained for a cultural deposit on the island that would place occupation at least as far back as 13,400 Cal BP. Our data indicate that hook and line technology appears on Cedros Island at least in the late Pleistocene, along with harpoons, as suggested by bifacial projectile points, turtle remains, and marine mammals, in conjunction with nets probably made from the fiber of agave, which are further evidenced by the abundance of small fish vertebrae. Other sites in Baja California Sur, notably on Espiritu Santo Island in the Sea of Cortez, have produced shellfish hooks dating to the early periods of occupation. These other hooks date in excess of 10,000 years ago, but have not yet been recovered from contexts as old as those on Isla Cedros. Likewise, single-piece shellfish hooks from the earliest recognizable fishing tackle along the Pacific coast of South America, but they have been dated to between 8,000 and 9,000 years old at this point. During the late Pleistocene and early Holocene, the bathymetry near the shore of the Paleo Island lacked the steep topographic relief that would have been necessary to fish deep-sea species from shore. Between 13,000 and 10,000 years ago, there was an extremely small number of places where water of 25 meters deep was less than about a kilometer distant from the paleo shoreline of the island. Along the southern part of the island and in almost all other areas, the first foragers would have traveled by boat at least 2 kilometers offshore to find waters of that depth to fish. The abundant remains of shallow water species associated with muddy or sandy substrates, in addition to sea turtles associated with seagrass meadow habitats, support the interpretation that the environment near the shores of Paleo Cedros Island was not exclusively dominated by steep and sloping bathymetry or even deep water. However, ocean whitefish, shown here, is one of the representative fish in the ichthyophonistic collections for the early period, and is a species that is most commonly found in waters that measure between 28 and 62 meters deep near rocky reefs and offshore banks in Alta California, and in waters between 80 and 150 meters deep in Baja California Sur. The only practical method for harvesting them in the terminal Pleistocene would have involved the use of hooks, stone weights, and fishing line, all of which we know were present, as well as the use of seaworthy boats to reach the outer edge of the kelp forest and the deep rocky reefs. Of special importance is a significant contrast with some of the early sites on the coast of Peru. The remains of fauna from Cedros Island are characterized by extreme diversity, not only of species, but of entire classes of fauna. The consistent and sustained exploitation of a wide range of resources represents a long familiarity with the ecozone, which, logically, indicates one of two possibilities. One, they arrived on the peninsula of Baja California without a maritime adaptation, but arrived long before they developed any of the archaeological evidence that we have recovered so far, provided an adequate period of time for landscape learning, and the always associated development of technology and traditional ecological knowledge. Okay, so that's option number one. Option number two, human populations that migrated along the Pacific coast of North America were already familiar with aquatic resources and simply adjusted existing strategies and technologies to the needs and restrictions of the new ecological conditions and availability of raw materials. The second possibility would have dramatically reduced the duration of landscape learning required for pioneer groups to establish stable ecological and social structures, both essential for a rapid and successful dispersion of human beings along the Pacific coast of the Americas. Both explanations remain viable, since human occupation in places like Paisley Cave, shown here, is dated to at least 500 years before the oldest sites thus far investigated on the Baja California Peninsula. Testing these two possibilities against one another will only be possible through further investigations on the peninsula and other portions of the North Pacific Rim, where geography, climate, and steep continental shelves provide enhanced opportunity to discover sites dating to the late Pleistocene. Beringia itself lies largely beyond the practical range of even underwater archaeology, but the Pacific coast of Mexico and the Japanese islands are among the ideal regions to search for connections. Archaeological sites in Indonesia, such as Lenehara Cave and other Melanesian sites, have produced single-piece shell fishhooks dating to the terminal Pleistocene. Even closer to the North American coastline by way of the Pacific Rim route is the site of Sakitari Cave on Okinawa, shown here, largest of the islands in the Ryukyu archipelago. At this locality, not only does evidence for the manufacture of single-piece shell fishhooks, shown here, extend back further than at any other deposit in the Western Pacific Rim, and quite possibly the world, but the insular context demonstrates unequivocally that seaworthy watercraft were employed by the inhabitants, who harvested a diverse range of marine resources with a sophisticated technological system. Enabled by a depth of ecological knowledge born from long residence in the dynamic coastal environments of the Pacific Rim seas, bejeweled with inspiringly beautiful islands. The similarities between terminal Pleistocene Okinawan assemblages and the Isla Cedros material are not limited to the generalized idea of fishhook. Both sets of hooks are manufactured from nacreous shells of abalone, though the Cedros hook assemblage also includes mussel shell as a raw material. Both sets have the same types of attachment shanks. Both sets appear to conform to a very similar range of size and shape, within which both populations would have recognized similar design characteristics. Additionally, Even the faunal assemblages from both Okinawa and Isla Cedros share interesting lines of convergence, including crustaceans as a significant component, along with the more expected molluscan and piscine fauna. In fact, it would appear that the kind of broad-spectrum adaptation so clearly demonstrated in the Isla Cedros assemblage, where every kind of plant and animal available to the terminal Pleistocene inhabitants was paralleled in the Okinawan deposits. Island populations necessarily demonstrate a settlement pattern that runs counter to our expectations of Pleistocene hunter-gatherers, being locations where the legendary highly mobile foraging groups would have been severely constrained by the very nature of insular geography. As a result, we have to reconfigure our image of these populations and create one where some mobility may have been employed seasonally for convenience, but it would not have resulted in movements of any great distance, certainly nowhere near the scope and scale of the mobility practiced ethnographically by populations in the high Arctic and Australia. In the latter cases, however, mobility is still constrained by available water sources, even when physical barriers to movement are minimal. No, for these groups occupying the western Pacific Rim and their descendants in the Pleistocene landscape of the Americas, they would have had strong senses of place, and their active acquisition of knowledge about the new lands before them would have proceeded as that of expectant new residents, rather than the cursory examination performed by peripatetic visitors. By discarding some of the assumptions and misapprehensions of previous generations of scholars, we may be able to form an increasingly complex and historically accurate image of the timing and nature of human population movements and socio-ecological adaptations that we include under the heading of Peopling of the New World. No longer confined to a point of origin in the taiga of Siberia and ways of life predicated on a terrestrial mode of production, we can expand our search and interpretive processes beyond the orthodoxy of the 20th century. Shifting our views in this way would suggest that the image of the initial migrants into the Americas, which held our attention for so many decades, was seriously flawed. While some of the descendants of the early settlers did indeed forge a new lifeway, focused on big game hunting in the interior of the North American continent, it was one which flowered and faded in one glorious but brief cultural spring. The Clovis phenomenon, which was one that occurred at least 1,000 years after the initial arrival of people on the continent, adds further strength to the suggestion that the apparent rapidity of its spread was due to it being a technology that spread among populations already in possession of the land and a detailed knowledge of basic resource distribution. Combining the implications of recent research demonstrating that the ice-free corridor was not available as a route for the initial migration to the Americas, that shell hooks were used at the height of the last glacial period in southern Japan and across the western Pacific Rim, and that these were also used on Cedros Island in the final centuries of the Pleistocene, we must consider the possibility that the initial routes of movement into the Americas had at least some of their points of origin among the coasts and islands of the western Pacific Rim, instead of exclusively originating in the interior of Siberia. Some recent genetic results may actually support multiple points of origin for the settlement of the Americas, with some participants in fact derived from Pacific Rim populations. In practical terms, both as regards their demonstrated possession of transportation technology in the form of seaworthy watercraft, and the fact that their homelands were more immediately susceptible to terminal Pleistocene climate disruptions than those people living hundreds of kilometers from the ocean, the people of the late Pleistocene Pacific Rim were undoubtedly among the populations that were forced into diasporic movements as geography changed in face of global climate change. This is a story within which we are not merely observers, and we may faintly hear echoes of our collective past and glimpse images of our possible futures, both potentially enlightening and disturbing at the same time. As we continue to search for and investigate new Pleistocene-age deposits in Baja California and elsewhere in Latin America, we may find that the first inhabitants, like other Pleistocene peoples of the Pacific Basin, were always seafarers. Their great funds of knowledge, instead of being erased by the experience of migration, were precisely what empowered them, allowing them to begin the settlement of some of the first truly unknown lands since our ancestors ventured beyond the mother continent of Africa. Thank you guys very much. Have a wonderful rest of your day.